I was trying to point out that the situation in Syria appears to be somewhat different in Egypt because Syria was much more closed politically and and didn't have the same cumulative um, process whereby you had activism that has been on the ground from late 90s, early 2000s, and different forms of organization and so on. I mean, what you had was just really very short, brief moments of opening and attempts at organizing, but they were always very, very quickly crushed. And a history of suppression much stronger, let's say, or with greater impact than what you had in Egypt by virtue of the just level of violence that Syria has seen historically. So that these various factors made it more difficult for people to organize on the ground and for people to I'm talking historically up to the beginning of 2011 basically. So that in fact when we had this first at the end of 2010 the Tunisian uprising and revolution, and then following that we've had the Egyptian one. They've set an example of the power of the people to engage and act collectively and so on. And this was an example to be followed, and it inspired activists throughout the Arab world. On the other hand, in fact, we can say that Syria didn't have that historical experience of organizing and opening as much as Egypt did, and therefore we didn't have the groundwork. But also, it was, I think, dealing with a much more complicated situation. It's a brutal regime, so was the Egyptian, but I think the Syrian relied more on a much more extensive security apparatus. We've talked about it, 15 departments and so on that is for a long time engaged in rounding up people and monitoring and surveillance and so on, making it practically impossible for people to meet and associate and think out even, how to improve and how to reform or how to press for demands. So all of this really disadvantaged the Syrians when they then decided, this is a good historical moment for them as well to press for opening and change and reform and whatever. But they, nonetheless, the calls were made for protest, and the calls were made for engagement, trying to just bring about an opening in the political system. What happened following that was, of course, that the regime responded with great brutality and a lot of violence, as what we have seen first in the southern city of Dara, where this actually began with children who were rounded up for writing just on their school walls that the people want to bring down the regime, the same slogan that was used in Egypt and Tunisia. And the fact that these school kids, perhaps the oldest of them was about 15 years old, that they were actually imprisoned for some time, and that there were talk of also them being tortured, and their families then had to respond, and the surrounding communities or the local communities respond to that, and that brought more people out on the street, and the regime, of course, responded brutally. You have these local, what I was talking about is that we have local communities that have been had different grievances relating to economic conditions, social conditions, but also now have national aspirations that transcend the localities by virtue of them just coming together to deal with the same kind of regime when it suppresses their freedoms and doesn't respond to their demands and so on. So, there's a kind of a meshing of the local with the national, I think, which is very interesting that is happening.